What's up, you guys? Why has not mangoes.
people who have Mozilla Firefox, for instance, it should begin to be questioned. I don't know how to go that far. You said it. I think it's a fun question to say, okay, how did you, let's not look at it as the browser, but talk to me about how you challenge the status quo. That's a good question. When you think about originals, who are the sort of landmark originals of our time in the world? What domain do we want to talk about? We're talking tech and business. I mean, it's hard not to put Elon Musk on that list. You can love him or hate him, but when it comes to dreaming up the vision, also taking the initiative and to try and make us a multi-planetary species of SpaceX, and build reusable rockets, which NASA had never really thought to do. Moving us into an all-electric car future. I think there are a lot of things to complain about with Elon's leadership and decision-making, the way he communicates on the platform for Twitter. But I think he's original, no doubt about it. How does he fit in the profile of religion? I think he fits first and foremost because he challenges the status quo in the beginning, and then secondly, I think he's relentless in trying to make his vision a reality, which is I think something that's driving some of his former fans crazy right now. Some people might say, well, he was like a child prodigy, or he was a child genius, so that's why he's so great. Do you agree with that statement? I think it's hard to say in his case. I think my job as a social scientist is to ask, what does the evidence tell us about child prodigies? It turns out we overestimate in a lot of cases because once something comes naturally to you often have a hard time thinking about it in a real way. So, you see kids, for example, who can play a Mozart sonata at age 4, and they do it over and over, amazingly fast bursts. And practice does make perfect, but it doesn't make me. They don't learn how to write their own original scores. They don't get experience with trial and error, and so they don't take enough risks to figure out how to invent something that's never existed before. That's not true in every case. It is empirically true that most child prodigies do not become known as adult geniuses. I think that's in part because they don't want to stretch their creative muscles. Is there everyone needs to be able to about this game, and they don't provide for more information in the same way that this game? In some cases, they get rewarded over and over again for basically just mastering everyone else's always done. So they don't learn to break free from geniuses. What is it that they have to break down? Well, a lot of it is what I come to think of as character skills, which is the set of capabilities to put your principles into practice. So they're often people with hidden potential. They may not be naturals at first. They could be underdogs or late bloomers or slow learners, but they are obsessive about making themselves uncomfortable, saying, if I can manipulate my strengths, then I'm never stretching myself, and I'm not taking on enough new challenges. There's a bunch of research to suggest that like sponges, they're soaking up lots of information and trying to filter what's helpful in and then kind of rule out what's harmful. And they're what I come to think of as imperfectionists, which is they're really careful and disciplined about saying when is it important to aim at the best and when is it okay to improve it. Perfectionism is a topic that we talk about a lot. I think it seems to me that everybody wants to be considered a perfectionist, as if being a perfectionist is good. What does that say about my values of being that I really care about things being great? Therefore means by way of that I think I produce great things. And saying you're not a perfectionist is also saying I make great work. You're saying that there are often times where it's better to be a perfectionist. The judgment you don't something is good enough. Yeah, I think you're up here. So, we have to answer that annoying job interview question. Everyone's favorite kind of Swedish perfectionist. It's like Michael Scott from The American Office. I think this is good. I work too hard. I care too much. And people do think that perfectionism is ultimately more of an asset than liability. That's why they be sustained or you have to be somewhat urgent. So let's go, let's move. I guess a perfectionist would, if their own devices would try and slow time down, they could focus more on this thing right now. They probably never ship that social network. They're probably used to being in a bedroom dinner somewhere working on it. Whereas Zuckerberg made that was good enough and shipped it. And learn from that and iterated the process of making something where it's probably more useful success than least. You know, the lean startups should start to look like yes, get it out there and learn from it versus just making it work.
Yeah, this is I think a key area recently that's been backed up by a bunch of experiments showing that founders who experiment more end up being more successful because they're able to pivot faster when something doesn't work and they get lots of market feedback signals on what's going to be successful advice and then I know you've lived that but you know it's interesting that you point this out because this is a lesson I learned firsthand during my days as a attempted athlete. So after being too short for basketball and too slow for football, I stumbled on a springboard diver. And by the way, I didn't know there's this thing as springboard diver. I was afraid of heights. And also, my teammates nicknamed me Frankenstein. I was so stiff. But I really loved it. And I wanted to get better at it. And I was a perfectionist. I thought that was cool. Because I think you're supposed to be a perfectionist. Well, guess what? I have the most basic dive, front dive rank, shit like I was going at first. I wanted to work on perfecting that practice. And I was working on this tiny little business. It was taking me from a 6.5 to a 7. And not ever working hard enough and failing to raise my degree. And that really stuck with me about that. So one day my coach, Eric Best, pulled me aside and he said, you know, Adam, there's no such thing as a perfect 10. And I was like, the annoying commencers will be lying to me when they say they're trying to set for perfect 10s. What's going on here? And he said, if you're in the world, 10 meals for excellence. There's no such thing as perfect 10. And that really shifted my perspective. What we did then was we said, look, we're never going to get this done. We have to calibrate what's a realistic goal for each of us. So for front dive, we started aiming for sets. And I would want to do 30 of them in practice. And when I did my third one, and Eric said that was a 7, it's time to move on. When I was learning a much more complicated front 2.5 of a full twist, you do 2 flips, 360 turn, and then a dive. The first goal was we want to do this for 2s. We just want to make it. And then I got a little better at it, and we started aiming for 4s and 5s. And see, I have to tell you, this has been one of the most useful lessons I've learned in my career, is when I start projects, whether it's a book or a podcast season or writing it off hand, the first thing I can for a book is a 9, because I'm going to pour 2 years of my work life in it. And I know a lot of people read it and it's useful, so it really matters to do it that as well as I can. When I'm writing a post for Instagram, I'm pretty content with this for that. Just above getting canceled is my perfect level. But that calibration is helpful. I can spend all day crafting that Instagram post and I'm never getting anything done.
When you're thinking about what's good enough through that framework, is part of the equation return on time spent? Because I'm thinking about the Instagram quote. If you have a 10 out of 10 Instagram quote, what's the return on that versus a 10 out of 10 book, which can completely change everything you've seen, change someone's entire life? Like a 10 out of 10 example, you have a phenomenal template for 10 million views, and that can change your entire life in a way that any Instagram quote. I've had some nice Instagram quotes. I've had a couple of viral ones. And my ended up in reference to what you said, post it. It never really does anything with you. But a 10 out of 10 incentive like you've got, or 10 out of 10 books like exceptional books, can change your whole life. So maybe part of the equation is to think about potential reward for investment.
I think that's such a powerful way to frame it. Well, let me react to a couple things. First of all, I don't take tests. So you're being over and I always want to know what can I do to get a little bit closer to 10. But I think thinking about the return on effort is really valuable. And I think about that less in terms of what's the immediate reward for me, and more in terms of how can I have the greatest impact for the investment of my time. I think you're right. It's a quick hit of dopamine. It feels really great when you get a lot of likes and enthusiastic comments like those. And then it fades really fast. And ask questions about a book that I wrote a decade ago. Nobody asked me about my social media post from several years ago. And I do podcasting actually right somewhere in between. We talk. Sometimes I do actually there's some evidence that audio is more memorable and more easy than when you pick up on the page. But I think it's a little more fleeting. I don't remember a conversation I listened to from a few years ago the same way I remember a book that changed my worldview. And so I put a little bit more into writing than I do into talking.
I want to talk to you about something you mentioned earlier, which is this idea of doing difficult things. You mentioned it in passing. The question that's going in my brain is, what is it that makes a certain type of person choose to lean into difficulty, and a certain type of person lean out of it? Because that is one of the key sort of correlating factors in success in life, your ability to choose discomfort.
Yeah, I think this is such a vital skill. And what I've learned to be really clear is it's skill. And it's not just a personality trait. Some people are born with a little extra, maybe you could say, reserve willpower, or they have the discipline, or the grit, or the resilience. It comes naturally to them. But this is very much a learned skill, and I think the clearest demonstration of this for me is the marshmallow test, which has been wildly misunderstood in the last few years. So if you're familiar probably with the classic demonstration that Walter Mischel did with his colleagues, where you take 4-year-olds, you put a marshmallow in front of them, and you say you can have one now, but if you're willing to wait until I come back, then you can have 2. And then the original finding is that if the longer you can delay gratification, if a kid can wait 10 or 15 minutes for the extra marshmallow, the better they score on a standardized test like the SAT. A decade later, the better grades they get in school. There are all kinds of benefits of this delay gratification cycle. Well, in psychology recently, there's been a controversy about whether it replicates. And some of the replications have shown that if you have lower socioeconomic status, you struggle with marshmallow tests. That's really disappointing, but it's not at all surprising. In fact, that was part of the original research, is if you grew up in a home of scarcity, and I know you can relate to this in your own lived experience, you could not afford to wait for the second marshmallow that might never come. You didn't know if you could trust the research teams currently improving. And so you didn't have the chance to practice that skill and learn how. What's really interesting is if you watch kids who crush the marshmallow test, it's more skill packed than willpower. What they have are simple strategies that actually make the temptation less tempting. So you see one kid will actually he sits on his hands, so that it's a little slower for him to reach out to the marshmallow. Another covers her eyes, so she doesn't have to look at it. And then there's one kid who actually smushes it into a ball and starts bouncing it, so I want to eat that kid. And this is why I say it's a set of skills, not just a matter of will, because if you have techniques for making discomfort less uncomfortable, and you know how to get, I guess if you know how to get comfortable being uncomfortable, then you are willing to go into many situations where you're a little bit out of your depth and say, this might be awkward, this might be embarrassing, but I'm going to learn something. And I guess, for me, that was public speaking. We touched on doing TED Talks. I would have never dreamed of standing in a red zone. I had no business whatsoever giving a TED Talk. I'm introvert. I'm extremely shy. I was terrified of speaking. And in one of my first lectures, a student wrote the feedback afterward, and I was so nervous, I was constantly beginning to physically shake. And the only way for me to get over it was to put myself continually in that situation and get used to this.
Is that the key here? Because I was thinking as you were speaking about the people who I look up to, like even like a David Goggins, who just seem to be able to hold themselves in this comfort more than anybody else. And a friend of mine from Brussels is running the entire length of Africa at the moment, from the bottom to the top of Africa. He's doing like 2 marathons a day in most days. And I'm thinking, are these people just like superhumans that were born with this switch in their brain that I can only tell if I have some kind of traumatic influence? Or does the evidence this is alerting?
I think everything that matters in life is always a complex interaction of nature and nurture. But I think we underestimate the power in these situations. So Goggins is a great example. He's a machine. Was he always that way? No. His
challenge the idea that if you reward effort, if you reward hard work, if you reward seeking out discovery, then over time, you in uncomfortable situations starts to take on secondary reward processes. In other words, you get a little bit of Pavlovian conditioning, where when you push yourself a little bit past where you're comfortable, that feels good, and you're used to that leading to something positive. And that can become sort of a self-reinforcing cycle.
I was thinking as you were saying that about the role trauma plays in people becoming successful. And if we take on this idea that those that push themselves forward and then get rewarded for it are more likely to repeat that behavior, the question should probably become, who are the people that got the greatest reward from pushing themselves out of their comfort? In my mind, for you to want to push yourself out of a situation, the situation's probably not great. And I was thinking about Goggins there, what he had to do. And many people that I saw this podcast and speak to, it appears to be the case a lot of time, that there was something traumatic or difficult going on in their home life with their parents maybe, that forced them or pushed them to pursue something out of their zone of comfort. It actually often pushes them off the road most frequently travelled, and they become like an original because they went through the shrubs and the prickly bushes. Is there evidence to support that it has helped them becoming more original?
So it's complicated because I think in a lot of the examples we look at, there's a survivorship bias. We see the people who manage to overcome adversity. We don't see all the people who are broken by it. And so we always have to pause and ask, is this causal? Or is it just revealing that certain people who happen to face adversity and we're able to take something out of that, we're growing from that. I do think what we know is that resilience is underestimated as a general rule. So if you look at, for example, rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, they are lower when people go through trauma than people's reports of post-traumatic growth. Saying, look, I wouldn't wish this on myself or anyone else. It was a terrible experience, but I had to grow from it, and it made me better or stronger. That's more common than being completely paralyzed or shattered by traumatic experiences. I think the other thing we know is that resilience is not an individual cycle. It's not a muscle you work on just by yourself. It requires a support system, which I think of as scaffolding. A temporary structure that helps you scale the height you reach under it. And I think a lot of what that looks like is having a parent, a mentor, a coach who believes in your potential, and not only helps you find motivation, but then gives you the tools to bounce forward from the hardship you face.
When we talk about the point of nurture, is I am the youngest of four kids. And in your work, we discussed how that can be consequential in my relationship with race and convention and all those things. What does the data say about siblings and how the order in which they're born can determine their characteristics?
Okay, we need a giant disclaimer on this. The science of birth order is a mess. It's full of conflicting findings. A lot of the world's leading experts don't agree on the patterns. And what I'm going to tell you is I think there are two patterns that have very consistent evidence across large samples of rigorous studies that they are tiny effects, tiny. So if they don't say anything about you and your future possibilities, there are patterns across very, very big samples. So let me start with the bad news first, Steve, which is on average, firstborns score slightly higher in IQ tests than their younger siblings.
I'm joking. I'm joking. That does make sense.
The major mechanism that seems to explain it is what's called the tutor effect, which is if you're the firstborn and you have younger siblings, you end up teaching them more. And when you explain things, you remember them better and you understand them better. The best way to learn something is to teach them. And the last born doesn't have a younger sibling to teach. And so sometimes they just miss out on that opportunity. Tiny difference on average. You will find many brilliant later borns, many average intelligence firstborns. So don't take anything from that. But it's an interesting finding. To the point that you raised, the other finding is that later borns tend to be more willing to take risks and become originals. And my favorite example of this comes from research Frank Sullivan did on sports. So
This is a study of every pair of brothers who ever played Major League Baseball. So they've got two siblings, same family, same parents, same upbringing. They both make it to the pros. Actually, sometimes there's even a trio. And the question is, which brother takes more risks when it comes to stealing a base? Which, in American baseball is one of the riskiest things you can do because it's very easy to get at. Because you have to basically outrun the ball flying in the air. And you have to outsmart a pitcher and guys who can catch the ball. And it turns out that the later borns are much more likely to take those risks. They're more likely to try to steal a base, and they're also more likely to succeed in stealing a base. So you're a last born. Why? Where does this penchant for risk taking come from? What's your hunch about that business?
Oh gosh. I know what it is. I know what it is. I saw it in your writing. And I was like, that's it. It's my parents gave me way more freedom. When I was 10 years old, and I say this a lot, but when I was 10 years old, if I left the house, I didn't come home for days. There was no consequences. Whereas I watched my sister try that when she was that same age, and it was like we would call the police. If she was at home before like 10, we would call the police. And as they went through the cycle of having kids and they got to the fourth one, it was almost like, it was like they assumed I was the age of the others, and they assumed that their job at parenting had been done. And that's what I attribute it to. Because in that independence, in that void, you can start to experiment. And you can start to learn and take risks. And then you get feedback from those experiments. Which for me was starting businesses at 12, then at 14. First kid in our family to not go to university. So it made a lot of sense when I read about it. And I also do believe that all my siblings have a high IQ than me. I think if we did an IQ test, I think every one of my siblings would be I think everyone would be. My brother's geniuses compared to me. Jason, my sibling that's a year older than me, went to two of the best universities, etc. He's a genius. He's much smarter than I am. But he will even say that what he learned from me was risk. He says this, he said it this Christmas. He's like, when you came to my house at when I was 18 and I slept on the sofa, he goes, he was in a university, he was off to get really, really great job. He was like an actuary, he had gone to the London School of Economics to study that. And I was this dropout sleeping on his sofa because I was stuck by London. And he said to me at Christmas, he was like, the fact that you weren't concerned about your future, it inspired me, which ultimately led him to quit his job in the city. He was like, I learned from you risk taking.
So that's amazing because you benefited from extra freedom and independence, and then you were able to actually pay that back to an older brother. I think for me that's also the most compelling reason why later borns end up taking more risks and trying new things. There is another theory that has some support that I think might be an additional piece of the story, which is usually the firstborn ends up sort of impressing parents by being a conventional achiever. And then the thinking is that niche is filled. And as a later born, you gotta find a way to stand out. Well, getting good grades in school is not gonna differentiate me from my older siblings. They're always gonna be ahead of me. So let me try something that's a little bit less try.
Well, I completely relate to that as well. Risk-taking. It is often believed that risk-taking is a key factor in what makes entrepreneurs successful in their life. In your research and your work in original, in chapter 1, page 17, kind of starts to debunk that in I think a really liberating way.
This is good news for me as somebody who's not a big risk taker. It turns out that risk takers are more likely to become entrepreneurs, but the most successful entrepreneurs don't love risk. They take cautious risks, and they're constantly trying to figure out how to reduce the downside and increase the upside. I guess this goes in two directions. One direction is to say, if you never take a risk, that's actually a risky way to live your life. It's like building a stock portfolio, where you only invest in safe, predictable mutual funds. No, you need a balanced portfolio. You're actually safer if you have some risky investments and some more cautious investments. And I think life is like that too. I think on the other side of that, you don't want to just be throwing caution to the wind and making a bunch of dumb bets. What you want to do is you want to figure out what's the probability of this unproven idea succeeding, and then do whatever you can to raise those odds.
Because that's not the story we hear in the movies and in the, and I guess that's part because we want to frame ourselves as heroes when we're telling a story. And so framing myself as a hero involves showing a huge, courageous risk you took. Whereas really, when if you zoom in, you'll see how the best entrepreneurs protect their downside of that risk.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's critical. So let's go back to Elon as an example. I had dinner with him a few years ago. I'm sort of interested in what can we learn from what's worked for him, and then also what hasn't. And I was talking to him about risk taking, and he was talking a lot about wanting to put the first humans on Mars. And I said, how could you possibly be willing to gamble with that? This was so unlikely. And he said, well, when I first started, I knew it was extremely low probability. And so that wasn't the original mission for SpaceX. The mission was, I want to build a reusable rocket. And that's much more realistic. And I can get people on board with that. And I can get a government contract to do that. And I said, okay, quantify this for me. What are the odds that you're going to make it to Mars in your lifetime? And he said, well, a couple years ago, I would have said, I don't know, 7, 8%. And you're doing this despite that? And he said, well, no. The probability has gone way up since then. Okay, tell me more. And he said, I'd probably say 11% chance now. This is firing you up? He's like, come on, that's double digits. Like, we're close to reality. But I think that calculus of saying, I've got to know that this is unrealistic. And I've got to have a side bet, which is something that can build me a viable company. And reusable rockets are what did it. That's what made SpaceX work. It's not the mission, the moon shot, or actually it's a Mars shot. That's not what ultimately allowed them to do what they do now.
Is that in part on his behalf a bit of a framing thing to, as you said, get people on board? Because I think about Neuralink in the same way. When he first started talking about Neuralink, it was all about interfacing with AI. And the AI is coming in really a way to be able to interface with it because it's going to be so much more advanced that we basically need to become these cyborgs. And in more recent times, he's focused on the ability to give people who have lost access to their limbs the use of their limbs back. And I was thinking about the transition methods and messaging. The latter, this idea of helping people who are disabled regain their ability, seems to be an idea that people will get on board with and will fight. The other idea of interfacing with AI and us becoming cyborgs doesn't appear to me like something people can get behind and fund.
No, they either don't get it or they don't want it.
Yeah, exactly.
Not for me. This is the common challenge for original thinkers. Is sometimes their bold visions are just not palatable to other people. And there's a term that I love that Deborah Meyerson and Maureen Scully coined. They talk about being a tempered radical, which I think is a great phrase to say, take your big extreme idea and try to run it to make it a little bit more familiar and a little bit closer to what other people think is plausible and desirable. And then if you do that successfully, you can smuggle your vision inside a Trojan horse.
And that's what I'm bringing with you. Let's talk about people, right? People in teams. One of my main obsessions is the topic of team culture, something that you write about in part 2 of the book. Team culture. What are we generally missing about what it takes to be and to build a great team? What are some of the sort of first myths that come to mind about the greatest teams you work as a
Well, this is one of the big topics in my world of organizational psychology, and there are, I think, a bunch of findings that might surprise me. The first one is that we elevate the wrong people in leadership roles. There's research on what's called the Babel effect, which is the idea that the more you talk in a meeting, the more likely you are to get selected as the leader of the team. So we reward people who dominate the conversation, even though they are not actually better at leadership. And often they're worse because they fail to include and learn from the voices around them. We're so obsessed with being the smartest person in the room that they fail to make the room smarter. And I think what happens there is that we're consistently mistaking their confidence for confidence. So we need to change that. The people I want to elevate in leadership roles are basically people who bring generosity and humility to the table. Generosity is about saying, I'm going to put my mission above my ego, and I'm going to try to make everybody in the room better. And I guess it's a form of servant leadership. And humility is about saying, it's my job to know what I don't know, and try to learn from every single person I work with. And I think the idea of being a lifelong learner is something we throw around a lot, but we don't take seriously. I think part of being a lifelong learner is recognizing that every person you meet is a potential teacher. Every single collaborator of yours has lived experiences you haven't, has expertise that you don't, and if you fail to realize that, you are stunting your own progress. So I think we've got to get humble givers in the leadership roles because they're there to make the team successful.
I've always had a suspicion that based on the size of the company and where it is in its life cycle, that a slightly different culture is required. And in your work, you talk about these commitment cultures. Now, a commitment culture, is that a culture?
I hope not. The good ones are. So you're anticipating Baron and Hannon research on hundreds of startups in 15 years. And they compare cultural blueprints where some founders say, I'm going to build a star culture. I want to hire the biggest geniuses, best talent, and that's what's going to make this great. And other founders say, man, I want to be about commitment. I'm going to focus first and foremost about do you fit the culture? Do you live our mission and our values? And then you run the horse race and ask which approach is more successful from a culture perspective. And lo and behold, the commitment cultures, they are dramatically less likely to fail, significantly more likely to go public. And you think, we're good. We've hired people who are all in on our company. They made us a wildly successful startup. And then guess what? After these companies go public, they grow slower than us. There's a major risk that if you are hiring on a culture fit, you are then saying, I'm only going to bring in people who are similar to each other. And you end up weeding out diversity of thought and background and promoting groupthink.
Interesting. So you're a little bit too close to the same painting.
You're replicating what's already working for you, becoming more and more homogeneous. And this is not to say the culture fit is inherently bad. You do want people aligned on your 3 to 5 core values, and that's important. And the mistake we make is when we look at fit, we think about, well, I want a bunch of people with the same personality traits, and I want a bunch of people who went to the same college, or studied the same subject, and then you end up with a really narrow band of expertise, and that leaves you to stagnate.
How important do you think the culture you're in is on your own chance of success and performance? I often think this. I think we've been lucky, even as a podcast team, to be in a great culture. And I play out the scenario, if we took one of our team members and maybe move them to another culture, how much would that impact that team member's personal performance and chance of success?
Actually, Boris Grossberg studies this. He studies what happens when you're a star in one culture and then you move to a new organization. So he studied this with Wall Street security analysts, so finance professionals. Turns out if you're a star performer at your current firm and you leave for a new firm, it takes you on average 5 years to recover your star performance, unless you take your team with you. And then you maintain your star status from day one. What Boris argues is that we underestimate the importance of the people we rely on to do our best work, and this is not unique at all to Wall Street. You can see it in research on cardiac surgeons, where you know how it's pretty common for surgeons to operate in multiple hospitals. Well, it turns out that the more practice you have at hospital A, the lower your patient mortality rate is at hospital A. But then when you go over to hospital B later that week, it's as if you haven't practiced at all because you're with a different team. They don't know your strengths and weaknesses. You haven't built effective routines together. You are much more interdependent than you realize, even if you think you're an individual expert. You can see it in sports too. It takes pro basketball teams 3 or 4 years on average, even if you've recruited a really talented team, to maximize their odds of winning a championship. You just haven't figured out how to be effective together. There's even there was a NASA simulation years ago where you had to go through a flight simulator, and some crews were exhausted. They just come off of a multi-leg, multi-day, sleep-deprived journey, and others were well rested. And it turned out that the well-rested crews, who were strangers, actually made more potentially catastrophic errors than exhausted crews that had just flown. Having a little bit of shared experience was enough to to compensate for the lack of sleep. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should have pilots fly together and only sleep for 2 hours a night. But the idea that your history together is only more important than how alert you are is something I think we ought to take really seriously.
Gosh, it's like a double-edged sword though, because so your history together matters. You want to be familiar with people. However, if you're too familiar with them, you're not going to come up with original ideas and ideas created and innovative as possible. So there's a balancing act between familiarity and novelty by way of introducing new members to people that have new ideas as it relates to business.
That's exactly right. And you actually see this in the sports data. After that, 3 or 4 years experience together, the benefits of shared experience start to level off. And maybe the players get old. That's part of it.
Yeah.
But the routines also become really predictable.
Predictable to the opposition as well.
Yes.
Other coaches can go, they always do this, they always do it like this. This is how we defend against it.
Same thing is true in business. I think it's one of the reasons why so much innovation and disruption comes from the outside. Because inside an organization, people get so attached to the way we've always done it. They fall victim to what's called cognitive entrenchment, where they start to take for granted assumptions that need to be questioned. And you need to bring in outside talent, fresh perspectives, or rotate yourself. Shift your country, shift your role, shift the group of people you're working with, go learn a new skill set in order to get out of that entrenchment.
When you think about, when you study companies and people that innovate, let's just focus specifically still on the idea of teams that innovate. Let's just bring it right back to the context of even, this podcast is actually about 32, 33 people now across the whole sort of business of the Diary of a CEO. It's going well. We do well.
Better than well.
Yeah. It's going well. It's like we've done a good job. I think that's fair to say. But there's a risk with that, which is when you've been right several times, you can start to get a little bit creatively complacent. And also, I saw, I think it's Morgan Housel's book, same as ever, some research that shows when you are succeeding, when you're like number one at the thing you do, teams kind of switch up creatively and they go into a defense mode, which is, okay, this is how we've always done it and it got us to here, so let's just keep doing it that way. But to self-disrupt almost doesn't make sense, So my question to you is, from what you understand, what is the best way to keep a team like ours continually striving for the next thing, even when the outside world thinks you do a lot of things right?
Best example I've ever seen was in a podcast episode I did at Pixar a few years ago. So let's go back to 2000. Pixar is at the top of its game. They've completely reinvented the way that animated movies are made. We used to think you had to draw them. Now they do them by computer. Toy Story is a huge hit. They've got monsters, they've got talking bugs. And the writing is high as you can in the entertainment industry. And what most companies would do in that situation is they would rest on their laurels and keep making films the way they've done them. Because, like you said, we should double down on our success. We know our core competency is getting a ton of rewards for it. Well, Steve Jobs and Ed Catmull, who were running the show, were not content to rest on their laurels, and they knew that when you're succeeding, you actually have the most slack capacity to disrupt yourself. Which is, of course, when most leaders are least likely to do it, because they don't think they need to. And they said, we've got to shake things up. So they went and hired an unproven director, Brad Bird. He was coming off a commercial flop. His previous film had been just a huge disappointment in terms of box office returns. And Brad came into Pixar. His charge was to change the way that they made animated films. Because they wanted to keep getting better and they wanted to keep innovating. And Brad came in with a vision that he was told was crazy for a new animated film. He was told it was going to cost $500 million and take 10 years to make, which is just a non-starter if you're a film studio. And Brad got frustrated. And he said, all right, you know what? He said, I want the pirates, I want the black sheep, I want people who are dissatisfied, disagreeable, disgruntled. And I'm going to build a band of misfits to try to prove that this movie can be made. And that group ends up finishing in a 3-year period. So they shaved a year at least off the original expected time. They end up coming in under budget becomes Pixar's most successful film ever. Wins them some major awards. You might have seen it. It's called The Incredibles. And what I think is incredible about that story is a couple things. One, just the will to break something that's not broken, deliver. I think that's huge. Number two, what Brad does is he discovers that there's a particular kind of disagreeableness that's really dominant. It's not just being cranky and ornery for the sake of it. It's not being. Later, Brad says, I want people who are like racing cars stuck in a garage. They're just being stifled and shot down, and I'm going to open the garage and let them go. So in my giver-taker framework, I would call those people disagreeable givers. They're gruff and tough on the surface, but they're doing it because they want to help and they have ideas to make things better. And they're not content to just stick with the status quo. And there's a bunch of research to suggest that people who are highly disagreeable, if they're challenging people because they can, they actually end up driving. And so I've actually started advising leaders that most of us know the value of a support network and surrounding ourselves with mentors and colleagues who have our back. But what you actually need to get better is a challenge network. A group of thoughtful critics who you trust to hold up mirrors so you can see your own blind spots. This is not the norm when I work with leaders. I think it's pretty common actually. I don't want to name a specific example here, but I have interacted with a fair number of entrepreneurs and CEOs who have this vision of them coming into the office one morning and saying good morning, and a bunch of people go, wait. It's scary. This is you gain status and power. It's hard to get people to tell you the truth. That's why those disagreeable givers who are willing to challenge you are so hard.
How do you cultivate that? What can you do to cultivate a circle of disagreeable characters? And just people that are going to tell you the truth.
Well, the first thing you do is you pay attention to who is actually the managers. And you let them know that they play that role in your life. So I've actually done this in the past couple of years. I've had people who tore apart book drafts for me, people who told me I needed to go back to the drawing board on an early version of TikTok. And I've gone to them and said, hey, you may not know this, but I actually consider you a founding member of my challenge network. First response, what the hell is a challenge network? Because disagreeable people always talk like that. No, they don't. But I had to explain it, and I said, I know I haven't always taken your challenges well. Sometimes they're offensive, other times just dismissive because I'm on a path and what you brought was diverting. And I regret that because I know I need you. You have to push me and question the way I do things. So if I were, if you ever hesitate because you're afraid of hurting my feelings or damaging our relationship, people might know you can hurt me. Expect not to. And the particular conversation I found really powerful there is to let people know that they often feel a tension between honesty and loyalty. I don't see a trade-off there. For me, honesty is the highest expression of loyalty. The more candid and direct you are with me, the more I will value your opinion. And sometimes that's enough. In other cases, I have to go a step further, which is something that I explored in some research. Turns out that sometimes asking people for input doesn't get them over. They're still afraid, or they think it's just an exercise in futility. So what you have to do is criticize yourself out loud and say, here are the things that I think I'm bad at. Here are the current shortcomings I see in your work. And what you're doing then is you're not just claiming your open feedback, you're moving your critique.
So in that instance where you criticize yourself out loud and say, oh, I'm so bad at this or that, is in part why you're doing that to make it a safe space for them to then build on what you just said?
Yeah, you're trying to create psychological safety. In the end, this describes it. And some research that I did with Konstantinos Kontiferis, we found that when leaders sat down and didn't just say, I want to know what I can do better at, but said, here are the things that I think I need to work on. A year later, when they were randomly assigned to do that, their teams actually were more willing to speak up and challenge them and give them constructive criticism. And I think part of what happens when we do that, and I actually do this in my own classroom. I read students some of the toughest feedback I've gotten in my career. One said that I reminded them of a Muppet. Never told me which Muppet. Thanks for that. There was another where a military leader had written, "I gained nothing from this session, and I trust the instructor got these points." It's not fun at the time, but what I find is when I read those comments out loud afterward, I hear much more honest input from my students. They tell me things that they think are not going well in my class. They give me new ideas for improvement. And I think what I've done there is I'm showing that I take my work really seriously. I don't take myself that seriously. And, I'm sort of unoffendable is the goal. And sometimes they build. Like they'll say, "Yeah, we see that weakness and we still need to work on it." And other times they say, "Well, maybe you have a blind spot. You didn't tell us about this area where you're struggling. We see this here." See, I have to say, a lot of people get the concept that are afraid to fail because they don't want to admit what they're bad at. And the people who work with them. Well, guess what? Who you work with every day? Right? So you might as well get credit for having the self-awareness to see it, and the humility and integrity to admit it out loud.
On this point of teams as well, and groups of people, the other thing that's quite challenging that I love that we discussed is this idea that brainstorming doesn't really work well. And to maximize collective intelligence, we get more and better ideas when we work alone. And again, there's a through line here when we said at the start about procrastination and the use of boredom. One thing that's really helped me recently that I wanted to share and see if there's any resonance with you is when I have ideas, usually when I'm alone, to be fair, or when I'm reading or when I'm thinking and writing about something, I then write them out into memos now, which is just like a couple of pages for me to understand them, and then I share them with people. Before, I didn't do that. Before I was a bit more of a pepperer, i.e. I take something I was thinking about and just pepper it into like a group chat. Whereas now having time and space to write about it seems to be helping them to refine the ideas better. It just helps them come up with better ideas. My question here is about how groups of people form their best ideas. And what you would suggest based on the research.
Well, you're living the edges. So let's unpack this a little bit. I think decades of research on brainstorming have shown that if you get a group of people together to generate ideas, if instead you had put them in separate rooms and let them work alone, you would have gotten more ideas, also better ideas. A lot of people are surprised by this, and there are a few reasons behind it that have great support. One is called production blocking. Can't all talk at once. Some ideas get lost. Two is ego threat. I don't want to look like an idiot, so I bite my tongue on the most unconventional ideas. And then three is conformity pressure, which is sometimes called the HIPPO effect. My favorite acronym, HIPPO stands for the highest paid person's effort. As soon as that's known, people jump on the bandwagon, and you get too much convergent thinking, not enough divergent thinking.
How do we pass that in organizations? Is it about analytic good ideas?
It can be. If you're in a low psychological safety environment where people are worried about their reputations, then yes, anonymous ideas help. But I want to get to a point where people are willing to put their names on their ideas. So I want to go in the direction that you've gone personally, which is psychologists recommend brain writing as an alternative to brainstorming. What you do is you recognize that writing is not just a tool for communicating, it's a tool for thinking. When you write out your thoughts, you can't get away with a half-baked idea that kind of is sold by your charisma. You actually get tested on your logic. And what you do is recognize that individuals are more creative than groups. They have more brilliant ideas, they have more variety than groups do. But they also have more terrible ideas than groups. And so we need a process to generate variety and then filter toward quality. And what brainwriting does is you have everybody write down their own separate ideas. Then you collect them, and you have everyone do independent ratings. So you get their judgment preserved before they're biased by what their peers think. Then once you have all the ratings, you take the most promising ideas and you begin developing and refining those. And what you're trying to do then is to take the wisdom of crowds to make the ideas with high potential succeed. And I think for me, brainwriting is one of the best ways to unlock the hidden potential in the group because it is not the loudest talker. It's not the most enthusiastic speaker who necessarily has the most compelling ideas.
I was thinking as you were talking about how I might implement that into some of my teams. I was thinking about So how would you create anonymity of the submission of the idea without people having some idea based on the way the person's writing who it is? You know, because there's some people in my teams that you'll be able to just know from how they wrote something who it was.
Here's an idea.
Yeah.
Thinking out loud. One thing I've tried from time to time is I paired people up to then write down and pitch each other's ideas. So you're separating the person who had the thought from the way it's being communicated. I wonder if rotating a little bit that way can help.
Okay, so you could have one person read out all the ideas basically to a full group and then have them written for yeah. Potential. Why did you write this book in Potential?
I wrote it really for two reasons. One is that I saw in the evidence that we underestimate potential in ourselves and others consistently. We think you can judge where people will land from where they start. But as we talked about with prodigies earlier, you can't always do that. And I'd read some classic research on world-class musicians, artists, athletes, and scientists, showing that they rarely stood out as better than their peers early on. Their early teachers, their coaches, even their own parents didn't know how much potential they had. And when they did stand out, it was not for unusual ability, it was for unusual motivation. They were driven, they were passionate. And I wanted to dispel the myth that if you're not instantly good at something, you should walk away from it and only play to your strengths. And I wanted to do that in part because it wasn't just the evidence that spoke to me, I lived this. I was a terrible springboard diver when I started. I never would have imagined that I was going to be a junior Olympic national qualifier. As we talked about, I really struggled with public speaking. I didn't expect to go there. And I also, I failed the writing test when I arrived at university and was assigned to remedial writing. And here I am an author. And so I've lived hidden potential along with studying it. And I felt like it was time to put those ideas out.
Do you believe that your potential exists somewhere, or do you think it's something that you create every time you push yourself?
Can I say both?
Yeah, that's probably the next best thing. I've always wondered this. I've always wondered if my life is the pursuit of my potential, or if my life is the creation of my potential.
That is a brilliant question. I love the way you frame that. I think it's always a little bit of both because we all have different skills and strengths that come naturally to us and different challenges that are hardwired. And so you can say, I had a ceiling on my athletic ability. There's certain things I'm never going to be able to do as badly as I wanted to become a professional athlete. But a big part of me learning how to become a decent diver was trying to raise that ceiling. And after I retired, Eric, my coach, said to me that I got farther with less talent than any diver he coached. I wasn't sure if that was a compliment, but it actually is a huge compliment because he felt like I'd stretched my capabilities. And I think for me, hidden potential is about realizing that we all have capacities for growth that are invisible to us and sometimes the people around us.
As it relates to unlocking that growth and being that overachiever that you were as it relates to diving, is there anything we haven't discussed that is critical to unlocking that potential?
I think so. I think...
Which one of those things down?
Yeah, so one of my favorites, can I tell you a little story?
Please.
One of my other challenges as a diver was I was afraid of heights and I also was afraid of extreme pain. But there's nothing fun about doing a belly flop when you're up on a 3-meter springboard, never mind a 10-meter platform, which I avoided like the plague. And I was especially afraid when it was time to try a new dive because I was going to hurl myself into midair, spin and twist, get lost, and there's a high probability that you're going to smack. So I would stand there at the end of the board shaking. I would waste a lot of time in practice. Sometimes it would be 5 minutes, 10 minutes. One practice, I stood on the board for 45 minutes, and I wouldn't go. I was wasting my time, I was wasting my teammates' time, I was wasting my coach's time. And Eric finally said to me, he said, Adam, are you going to do this dive? And I'm like, ever? Yes, of course, one day I will do this dive. And he said, great, then what are you waiting for? And I've heard that voice in my head every time I've been afraid to take a risk. And I've been hesitating to go outside my comfort zone. I heard it when I was afraid to write my first book, and I didn't think I was ready. I heard it when I was considering giving a TED Talk and I didn't feel capable of doing a good job in it. I think the lesson I took from that was I thought that I had to build my confidence in order to take the lead. And that was completely backward. You build your confidence by taking the lead. And so I was kind of waiting for the magic day when I felt ready. And the reality is, you become ready by putting yourself in situations that you don't think you can excel at yet.
Do you think that's enough to push people off the board? As a sort of an analogy for life generally, because there'll be so many people that have just heard that, and just hearing that will enable some of them to take the leap. And then there's this other stubborn crowd that will hear that will understand it, that will believe it's true, and they still won't take the leap. They still will stay in that job. They still won't push themselves beyond their zone of comfort. Is there anything else that's required to get those people over the edge, or is it too individualistic to know?
Well, I think one thing that group of people might have in common is pervasive imposter syndrome. Right? The sense that, well, first of all, when people talk about imposter syndrome, sometimes they say, okay, like, I'm a fraud, and it's only a matter of minutes until everybody finds out. And that feeling is actually pretty rare. What's much more common, if you look at the research of Basima Tufik, is imposter thoughts. Everyday doubts about, am I as good as other people think I am? Am I ready for this role that other people are encouraging me to take on? Can I afford to quit my job and try becoming an entrepreneur? And what the research suggests is that there are actually some surprising benefits of having those imposter thoughts. Basima finds, she studies medical professionals, investment professionals, military cadets, students, that when you have more frequent imposter thoughts, they actually can become fuel to motivate you to persist toward your goals. And the reason that happens is there's a gap between what other people think you're capable of and what you feel prepared for. And you realize, okay, I've got to put in extra effort, and I've got to be better at listening to other people and learning from them in order to close the gap. So Basima's advice is when you feel like an imposter, you should recognize that other people think you're pretty amazing, and now, all right, let's live up to those expectations. And I would go even further. I would say it's really tempting to trust your own judgment of your abilities above other people because you know more about yourself than any other human can possibly know about you. But here's the problem. You know too much about yourself to compare yourself accurately to others, and you're also not neutral. Right? You can't be objective and independent and unbiased. So I think what you want to do is you want to see yourself through the eyes of people who know you well. And if multiple people believe in you, it's probably time to believe them.
Give me one more. Let's make this the closing one. As it relates to realizing our potential and unlocking our hidden potential, which is, if I was able to achieve anything with this podcast over the time that we ran it, allowing people to realize and pursue their potential, I think would be one of the greatest achievements that we as a team could have achieved by doing this podcast. It's something that I think people's, much of their happiness, much of their fulfillment, much of their health probably lies in the pursuit of their potential, whatever that means, and all of the opposite stuff, much of actually their unhappiness probably lies in their regret and their understanding that they can and could have done more in their lives. I mean, think about Brené Brown all the time, that study she did on those palliative patients, where so many of them wish they'd lived the life true to themselves, so many of them wish that they'd taken that jump and pursued that thing that was maybe a little bit more risky. So what is the closing argument here for those people that are trying to unlock their hidden potential?
Well, I think if you look at regret,
Lakita.
psychologists find that our
Hey,
biggest regrets in
Lakita.
the long run are not our failures. They're our failures to try. And it's the actions not taken that we wish we could redo most. I think finding the motivation and the courage to take those risks is not always easy for people. And I think one thing that I found helpful over time that has some good evidence behind it is a lot of us know we need other people's input in order to get better. So what we do is we ask for feedback. And the problem with asking for feedback is you end up with a bunch of cheerleaders and critics. The cheerleaders you don't fully trust because they see you through rose-colored glasses and they just applaud your best self. The critics are devastating. They attack your worst self. We want our coaches, people who see your hidden potential and help you become a better version of yourself. And see, I mean, Steve, you've seen this forever. World-class athletes and musicians and actors have coaches. We all need coaches in our lives. And they don't have to be somebody we hire. You don't have to have a budget. There are people that you rely on who are part of that challenge network, who enable you to keep growing. So how do you get your cheerleaders and critics to be better coaches? What you do is, instead of asking them for feedback, you seek their advice. When you ask for feedback, people look at the past. If you ask for advice, they turn to the future, and they become more specific and more actionable in giving you tips and suggestions. So if you go back, I'll give you the personal example on this one. Go back to the military leaders that I taught, who told me that they gained nothing from my session, but they hope I learned something. I've got a bunch of critics in that situation, and you know they're demoralizing me. I want to give up. Like, I wonder if I could actually build the ability to hibernate, and then in a few months I'll feel better. But I had committed to teach a second session for these military leaders, and it was about a week later. I didn't have time to reboot all my content, and so I went to my critics and tried to turn them into coaches, and I asked them for advice on what to do differently in the next session. And one of them said, a big mistake I made was I led with my credentials. And I tried to convince them that I was an expert. Well, I was 25 years old. These are seasoned military leaders. They've got multi-billion-pound budgets. They've got thousands of flying hours under their belts. They've got Top Gun-style nicknames. I'm not going to convince them that I am more experienced than they are. And this one person said, you know, you should try calling out the elephant in the room. Be a little more vulnerable. So I walk in the next week, I look out at the room, and I say, all right, I know what you're all thinking right now. What could I possibly learn from a professor who's 12 years old? Silence. And then one guy, call sign Stan Newton, jumps in and he says, that's ridiculous. You gotta be at least 13. They all burst out laughing. It broke the ice. I more or less taught the same material. But the feedback was much more positive afterward. They told me that although I was junior in experience, I dealt with the evidence in an interesting way, and they liked learning from somebody who was almost as young as the millennials they were trying to lead. And I learned from that experience that the very people it felt like they were trying to take me down, if I asked for their advice instead of their feedback, they actually gave me a tip that built me up.
It made me think about something that I learned from reading your work, which is this difference between self-promotion and idea promotion as well. I actually sent it to a friend earlier on. My friend runs a personal branding company. It's called Ashley. The company's called Great Influence. And he spends his time basically helping leaders build their personal brand. And he'll often send me things that he's seen online. And when I read about your concept of self-promotion versus idea promotion, I realized that all the things he sends me that are bad are self-promotion, and all the things that he sends me are good are fundamentally idea promotion. What is the distinction, just so we're clear?
I think the distinction for me is that self-promotion is about saying, look at me. Let me tell you about all my accomplishments and awards. I'm going to show off my trophies, and I'm trying to impress you and make you think that I'm great. Idea promotion is saying, I have something worth sharing, and I want to elevate a product, a service, an insight. And people have dramatically different reactions to the two. Right? The first comes across as narcissistic and bragging and self-centered. The second is actually seen as an act of generosity. You're taking your knowledge and your skills and you're trying to create a gift for other people and hoping that they receive it. And I think this is so important because a lot of people don't share their ideas. They don't put their work out there because they're afraid of looking like they're self-promoting. And they are doing such a disservice to the world by not releasing their creativity.
So many people have a problem with that. So many people have a problem, especially when they're making a transition from being someone who was quiet or silent to that first post, that first book, that first. And part of that is because of the impact it has on the people that know you. So for me, for example, the first time I wrote like a quote or an idea of mine, I felt that anxiety of, oh my God, my friends from school are going to think I think I'm like Mahatma Gandhi or like Nelson Mandela or something, because I'm sharing my ideas. And the sheer fact that I'm sharing my ideas means that I think I've got good ideas and I think I'm smart. And so the best thing to do is just not to share the ideas so that my friends don't judge me. For whatever reason, I managed to persist and I shared an idea. And I actually, in the early stages of sharing my ideas on the internet, I got some feedback from my friend Jamie, who told me one of our mutual friends was like, "You think he is?" This was like 9 years ago, maybe. Who the fuck does he think he is? He thinks he's da 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 da, etc. That was difficult, persisted, and I'm so glad I did because it changed my life. And I think there's so many people that are in that exact moment where they've got ideas, they've got skills that they could share. It would transform their lives and add value to the lives of other people, but they're stuck because, yeah, they're scared of it feeling like self-promotion.
I believe everyone has ideas worth sharing, and that we have a responsibility to not deprive the people around us from learning. And I think the great thing about the democratization of knowledge is that anybody can access anybody else's ideas. And so I think there's an opportunity for all of us to put our thoughts out there. This might be an unpopular opinion, but I don't think the framing as personal branding is helpful. Because it center stage is self-promotion. I don't want to have a brand. When people tell me I said something on brand, I feel like I've been typecast or I'm losing my authenticity. What I want is I want to have a reputation. I don't want to be a shiny product that's packaged with a bunch of slogans. I want to be somebody who's known for a set of values. And one of those values is original thinking and rethinking. And that means I should even disagree with my own ideas. If I don't contradict myself, I am failing to learn. Gosh, I remember after Give and Take came out, I got branded as the nice guys finish first guy for the givers over takers message. And I was so annoyed by that, first of all, because a lot of givers aren't nice. Helping other people is different from being polite to them. And the disagreeable givers were a case in point of that. And eventually I was like, maybe my next book needs to be called Take and Take. And write about why selfish assholes succeed, just because I'm so committed to evolving what I think. And I don't think you do that if you're trying to maintain a personal brand that's consistent in representing a certain slogan. I think you do that if you're trying to live a set of values.
Amen. It really has made me rethink not just the term personal branding, but really the true purpose of idea promotion is the pursuit of truth, right, and knowledge. And in the process of that, you obviously gain a ton yourself. But we talked about earlier, I think we often call it the Feynman technique, where by writing and sharing, you're actually learning more than anyone else. I think it was James Clear that said the person that learns more in any classroom is in fact the teacher. But the importance of being okay with being inconsistent, being continually wrong, your old work contradicting your new work, is very important, but not easy to do because of the cognitive dissonance that admitting you're wrong creates.
This is a central question of Think Again, and I'm so struck. I originally learned this framework from Phil Tetlock, and then I started studying it. I'm so struck by how many people spend too many of their waking hours thinking like preachers, prosecutors, and politicians. So when you go into preacher mode, you're proselytizing your own ideas. In prosecutor mode, you're attacking somebody else's ideas. And in politician mode, you don't even bother to listen to people unless they already agree with your ideas. And I always like to ask, I find that most people have a dominant style that gets them in trouble. So mine is prosecutor mode. If I think you're wrong, it is my professional and moral responsibility to correct you, which never goes well, and I've even been called a logic bully, which my wife had to explain because it was not a compliment.
I think I'm a logic bully.
Are you?
Yeah, I think so sometimes.
Fellow prosecutor.
Maybe this is an excuse, so maybe I'm bullshitting myself here. But when I hear an idea, I think part of my pursuit of learning is by challenging it. And that's not always a good thing, especially with your girlfriend. And she's just trying to tell you something, and you're like, no, but logically, and I read this study and I did this podcast, It's like you don't need to interact with people like that all the time.
I make this mistake all the time. And Allison calls me out regularly. Like, you actually do not need to argue with an idea to understand it. And you don't have to pressure test every single point that's made. Sometimes you can sit and learn from other people, as opposed to duking it out to try to figure out who's right. And I think it's such an important note, because in prosecutor mode, you've already concluded that other people are wrong, and you're right. So you lose the ability to open your mind. And the same thing happens if you're preaching or politicking. You're basically drinking your own Kool-Aid or listening only to your own tribe and trapping yourself in an echo chamber. And so I got really curious about how do we get out of those modes? What's an alternative? And my favorite alternative is to think more like a scientist. When I say think like a scientist, I do not mean that you need to buy a microscope or a telescope. I mean that you don't let your ideas become your identity. That you recognize every opinion you hold is just a hypothesis. You can test it. Every decision you make, just an experiment. It might succeed, it might fail. And when you do that, it turns out when people can be taught to think more like scientists, when you teach people to see their opinions as hypotheses, their decisions as experiments, lo and behold, they make better choices. They achieve more success because they become more flexible. They change their minds faster. They're quicker to recognize that they're wrong, and that means they're quicker to get it right.
But if Jack had loads of ideas, and every single time any idea came out of his mouth, even if it was a good morning, and we all went, Jack, you're so right. It's hard to see how Jack's self-esteem or his ego doesn't take a boost there, and him become more committed to being right in the future. Because then imagine if we did that for 1 year as an experiment, then suddenly we turn around one day and go, Jack, what are you talking about? That is wrong. You can imagine his ego, swelling and going, duh. So I guess what I'm trying to say is how difficult it is for us to disassociate our self-worth with being right.
Yes. Yeah, a colleague once told me that the worst problem he sees in humanity is the addiction to being right.
Yeah.
And I think it's much more important to focus on getting it right than being right. And one of the ways you do that is you do not let your beliefs become part of your self-concept. So people are like, wait, what do you base it? Who are you if you're not what you think? You are what you value. What's the difference between values and beliefs? Beliefs are what you think is true. Values are what you think is important. And I think this is such a critical distinction because when you start to base your identity, your sense of self, and your ego and your self-esteem and self-worth on what you think is true, then admitting you were wrong is a major threat. Whereas when you start to see yourself as someone who values curiosity or is a lifelong learner, now changing your mind is a moment of growth. So a simple example, before evidence-based medicine, there were a lot of people who called themselves doctors. They're like, oh, you're feeling anxious? Let's give you a frontal lobotomy. You think that's an effective way to treat anxiety. That's a belief of yours, right? If that becomes part of your identity, if you see yourself as a professional lobotomist, you are never going to believe the evidence that this is harmful. If you see yourself instead as somebody who helps treat anxiety, and that's your value, the moment you read the careful evidence saying this is not working and it's also really dangerous, is the moment you change your mind. And so I think what this means fundamentally is you have a set of principles that you stay true to, but you're very flexible when it comes to your practices and policies.
I'm going to do my very, very best.
Try it at your own risk.
Yeah, I'm going to try. Alan, thank you. Thank you for all the work you do because you forced me to challenge myself over and over again in all the books you've written. But central to all the books you've written is the idea of challenging oneself, which I think is one of the most important messages, which is just this continual pursuit of truth, knowledge, and questioning the status quo and then questioning that. And I think that process of sort of iterative experimentation, that humility, that ability to maintain the student mindset throughout your career is the path to success. In both your professional pursuits, but also your personal ones. One of the things that's really helped me in my relationships is this idea of remaining humble to new information. In fact, you embody that as a human being, but you embody it in all of your work. And your work is original. And that's why it's so challenging. Something I aspire to in the work that I make is to go to those extra lengths to create wonderfully original work. I sometimes sit on this show and I will recommend someone to go and buy one of the author's books, but in this case, I can't because I think people need to buy them all. They will offer something so challenging in a very important way. The Hidden Potential is the newest book, right? That's the brand new, that came out in October last year, didn't it? But they're all essential books for different chapters and different perspectives and different phases of life. So I recommend that everybody go buy all three of the books that I have in here, which is the originals Think Again and Hidden Potential. Get them as a nice little package deal on Amazon because they are really important books to push your thinking forward. And that's exactly what you've done huge thank you from myself, but also from millions of people that have benefited from your work.
Thank you. That's incredibly generous of you. It means a lot to me considering the source because you are an original. And one of the things I love about Diary of the CEO is you are constantly challenging people to rethink their ideas and to try new things and unlock their hidden potential. So you're doing what I study on this show, and I think it's amazing. Not anyone can make Malcolm Gladwell cry. I've known him for over a decade. I've never seen him break down into tears before or since. So well done there. Before we wrap, I have a couple questions for you.
Oh, go ahead.
I stuck a couple in as we were going, but there were a couple things I was curious about. If you're game.
Why do I feel nervous?
You turn the tables here. You shouldn't be nervous.
Isn't this cool? Every single conversation I have around the Diary of a CEO, at the very end of it, you'll know, I ask the guest to leave a question in the Diary of a CEO. And what we've done is we've turned every single question written in the Diary of a CEO into these conversation cards that you can play at home. So you've got every guest that you've ever had, their question, and on the back of it, if you scan that QR code, you get to watch the person who answered that question. We're finally revealing all of the questions and the people that answered the question. The brand new version 2 updated conversation cards are out right now at theconversationcards.com. Quick one, if you guys have heard me speak on this podcast before about company culture and the secret to building a world-class company, you know that everything starts with people. Which brings me to our sponsor on this podcast, which I'm very excited to have today, which is LinkedIn Jobs. The entrepreneurs and business owners that listen to this podcast, you'll probably want to hear this one, so stay tuned for a second. Whenever I'm looking to hire, my first port of call is LinkedIn Jobs. Throughout all of my companies, this is our go-to method of hiring. And let me tell you why.